So recently, we finished up our sermon series through Advent, right? And we were looking at the birth of Christ, how he came in human form to the earth. And now we're going back a bit further in history to the Old Testament. And we're going to spend the next few weeks on the book of Judges. So, some of you might be very familiar with the book of Judges. Some of you might not be. Some of you, when you hear Judges, you think about the Supreme Court and people with a gavel or wigs or big black robes. That's what I always thought of when I heard the name Judges. And then in Sunday school I learned, Samson was a judge. He seems really great. He was a big, strong guy and he had cool hair. And I went back and read Judges in a Bible study at my church over this past year, and it is not how I remember it as a kid. So we're going to be dealing with some things in the next few weeks that address a lot of failure and a lot of pain, people who are turning from God. But the big theme throughout all of it is Israel's apostasy and God's faithfulness. And apostasy is just kind of this theological word for turning from God, kind of trying to leave God. So, today is an introduction to this series on Judges. And as any good introduction, we're going to have some context. We're going to talk about the big ideas and what the big point is. So the first thing is the setting, then we're going to talk about the cycle in Judges that happens over and over, and then the message of Judges. And Jacob will be doing the Bible study also on Judges, so you'll kind of be hearing about it from different angles over the next 6 or 7 weeks. So if we were to have a quick timeline to kind of put this book in context, when I was younger, learned the books of the Bible in order by this song. And we would sing Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then it keeps going. So that's where Judges is. It's right after Joshua. The first 5 books are the books of Moses, or the Pentateuch, and then we have Joshua, and then Judges. So we have creation, happened in Genesis 1 through 11, and creation we know is Adam and Eve. It's the Garden of Eden. It's the snake showing up in the rebellion and the fall. And then we have Abraham starting in Genesis 12. And he's told that he will be made into a great nation, that he will be blessed, and he will bless other families. After him we have Moses, who receives the law of God. He leads his people out of slavery in Egypt in the event called the Exodus, which we're all familiar with. There's a book of the Bible about it. It's probably one of the biggest moments in the history of the Old Testament, showing us God's faithfulness to deliver his people even from slavery in another country. And then we have Joshua, because after Moses led them out of Egypt, they were wandering in the desert for 40 years, and Moses struck the rock and he was told that he wouldn't enter the promised land, but Joshua would lead them into the promised land. So after Joshua does that, there's a lot of conquests, and Joshua dies, and then we have Judges. So this is where we find ourselves kind of in the course, in a brief history of the Old Testament. And in Judges, the people are going their own way. They're not following God the way they did before. Some of you might be familiar with this concept of like the good old days. And I hear about it quite a bit, that, in the good old days we didn't have internet and we didn't have cell phones and people looked you in the eye when they talked, and in the good old days you could play outside with, without street lights because everything was safer, things like that. So in Judges there were probably a lot of people thinking the same thing, in the good old days, in the times of Joshua, when we were freed, when we were entering the promised land. So there's a commentator named David Howard who says that in the book of Joshua, things went pretty well. And it ended on a peaceful note with families settling in the land. There was a fulfillment of the land promise that was related to Israel's obedience to God, to Yahweh. And there were a few hints in Joshua that the people did not fully complete the conquest that was before them, and that their obedience was not total to the Lord. And in the book of Judges, we kind of see the outworking of this lack of perfect obedience, and that kind of spirals into worse and worse disobedience and turning from God. At the end of Joshua, we get a really famous few verses in Joshua 24:14 through 16, where he says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness." Joshua is speaking from the word of the Lord. "Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord, to serve other gods." So at the end of Joshua, after they've entered the promised land, they've had all the conquest, they were mostly obedient. He puts it before them, choose who you will serve. Are you going to worship the false gods that your ancestors served? Are you going to worship the false gods that are among you, of the people in whose land you're living today? Or will you worship Yahweh? And they say, we will worship Yahweh. They're committed. And it doesn't always work out that well, and we're going to see that throughout the book of Judges. Throughout the book, there's a cycle that the Israelites go through, and I have an image here that I'm going to try to put up on the screen so that you can see it. There we go. So this cycle, there are three main kinds of characters that we're going to be addressing. There's God, and the Israelites, and then the Canaanites, or the other people. And the way Jacob will describe it, probably in the Bible study and in other sermons, is that those three are interacting, and God wants us to be committed to him and not follow the ways of the Canaanites or, the other tribes around. So what we see is, at the beginning of each small story in the cycle of Judges, Israel starts out serving the Lord, and they have a certain amount of years of peace, and everything is good, and the relationship is healthy. But then Israel falls into sin and idolatry, oftentimes because they're mixing their faith with the false gods of the people around them. And then Israel is oppressed. Whatever tribe it is that they're hanging out with, that they're kind of being tempted into worshiping their gods, they will overtake them and oppress Israel, similarly to how it was in Egypt. Maybe not as bad, but that oppression lasts for years. And that's something that's easy to overlook in Judges, that they might be oppressed for 8 years or 20 years. It's a long time. And then eventually they can't take it anymore, and Israel cries out to the Lord. They say, "Lord, this is horrible. We got here, we put ourselves here," or sometimes they don't acknowledge that they put themselves there, "but we need you, Lord. Please deliver us. Please save us like you did in Egypt." And God decides that he will save them. He will be faithful. He will raise up a judge. At this time, Israel didn't have a king like David. David and Solomon would come later. So a judge was just kind of a common person who God said, "You're going to be in charge. You're going to lead Israel. You're going to free them from this oppression." So then the second to last step, that Israel is delivered. The judge, oftentimes throughout the book, it will say the Spirit of the Lord came upon him or upon her, and then they delivered Israel. It'll say they defeated this many people. They delivered Israel. Israel lived in peace and served the Lord for 40 years or 20 years. And then they start again. So that's the cycle that we're looking at in Judges. It's a cycle of idolatry, oppression, crying out to God. God raises up a judge. Israel is delivered. They're in good, healthy, committed relationship, and then they do it again. So that's the image that I wanted to share with you, and you'll see that over and over and over throughout the book of Judges as we learn from it. And the interesting thing about this cycle is that it's not a perfect circle, it's kind of a spiral. And the very unfortunate thing is that it's a downward spiral. It gets worse and worse. You would hope that the Israelites would, make mistakes, but they would get better and be more obedient. But that's not how it goes. And throughout the book, as the cycle continues and it spirals further and further downward, the times of peace get shorter, the times of oppression get longer, the idolatry gets deeper, the judges themselves that God raises up, they get worse, they get less obedient themselves, and then the sin becomes more grotesque. And that's one of the things that's really hard to read about in this book. But it's a part of it. And we can't really overlook that. So I hate to say it, but in the next few weeks, as we learn from Judges, it's not full of happy, cheerful stories. It's kind of painful and it's kind of hard. But like we said in the beginning, in the face of Israel's apostasy, Israel turning from God, feeling the effects of their sin and idolatry, God is faithful. God isn't leaving them. And the book of Judges kind of strips away every other possibility of hope and leaves God as the only hope. And that's a big thing for us to learn, and learn over and over and over again. And that's something that I hope that we can take from it. So Israel, while they're in this cycle, this downward spiral, there's a common refrain in the book that each person did what was right in his own eyes, or did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It kind of shifts. It says in the beginning they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and then towards the end they did what was right in their own eyes. Because in the beginning they're still kind of acknowledging God. They're saying, this is wrong, this is evil in the eyes of God. God says this is evil. But by the end, they're not judging their actions against what God has planned for them. They're saying, I want to do this, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to do what's right in my eyes. I'm going to do what's fun or what feels good or just what I want to do. So the people did what was right in their own eyes. And when this failed them, they were oppressed. They were made slaves. They were at that lowest point of the cycle. Then they cry out to God, and God in his mercy delivers them. So our text today that gives us a snapshot of this is from Judges chapter 3, verses 7 through 11. If you have one of the Bibles from the table, it should be on page 240. Your bookmark might be there already. It's the story of Othniel. Great name. If any of you might have grandkids or great-grandkids soon and they're thinking of names, consider Othniel. It's a lot of fun. I've never met one, but I'd like to. So if you would read with me in chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, this is going to give us one judge's story and a short glimpse that encapsulates the cycle. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Asherahs. The anger of the Lord burned against Israel so that he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram Naharaim, to whom the Israelites were subject for 8 years. But when they cried out to the Lord, he raised up for them a deliverer, Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, who saved them. The Spirit of the Lord came on him, so that he became Israel's judge and went to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Aram, into the hands of Othniel, who overpowered him. So the land had peace for 40 years, until Othniel, son of Kenaz, died. So that's a short glimpse. It kind of seems like it moves really quickly. It's covering at least 48 years of time, which is a lot. I don't know about you, but when I'm reading the Bible, it's easy to read a certain amount of years and not think about that and not kind of consider what that would be like to be oppressed for 8 years. So some of you may have been living here for more than 8 years, but if you've been living here for 2 and it seems like a long time, 8 years is 4 times that. But this is in the beginning part of the book, so the oppression is shorter and the peace is longer. They had peace for 40 years. But that kind of shifts towards the end. The oppression gets longer and the peace gets shorter. But we see in this verse, in these verses, that Israel did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They were oppressed. They cried out. God raised up a judge. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him. He delivered them, and then they had peace. And I haven't read the immediate following verses in a little while, but I bet the cycle happens again. So the cycle in Judges reminds us over and over and over and over again about our tendency to turn from God. We read the story of his people, but I don't know about you, but I can see this kind of cycle in myself. And it might not be the same downward trajectory every time, but like I said earlier, all other hope is stripped away. They try to put their hope in false gods. They try to put their hope in themselves. They try to put their hope even in their judges, and they fail too, and God is the only hope. His faithfulness is what we're relying on. Which brings us to our last point, which is the message of the book of Judges. We talked about Israel's apostasy and God's faithfulness. In a time where there are a lot of tribes and they're worshiping a lot of gods, it would make sense that people kind of ask if their God is the best. And they're wondering, can this God be trusted? Because these folks over here, they have a God who, apparently that God's whole job is to give them crops. And this God's whole job is to make the sun shine, and like they can probably do that really well, and it seems to be working for them. The Israelites, God's people, in Judges, are looking at a buffet table of deity delights. They had the opportunity to worship all kinds of other gods, and they did. One way to test the strength of a relationship, because the Israelites, God's people, and God are in a relationship. One way to test it is to see how people handle a conflict or an offense. So if I think back through relationships I've been in, when I was in high school, I was a freshman, I was in this group of friends and everyone started pairing off. They started dating, and I thought, well, I guess this is what we do. So for a few months I dated my friend Molly, and by dated we went to football games and held hands, and then eventually I thought, we don't really need to do this, we're just friends. So we broke up. That relationship did not survive very much, right? Then I dated a girl named Rachel, and we had a conflict. I said, hey, let's work on this. She said, no, I'm okay, and she broke up with me. That relationship could not handle a conflict. And now I'm married to Shelby. We've been married over 2 years. We've had a little bit of conflict, as you might, in the first 2 years of marriage, putting together 2 adult lives. And we're still together, and we're going to be together. We're married, we're committed to each other. Our relationship has weathered storms of conflict, and it will continue to. But when that conflict comes up, does the relationship end, or does it continue? Are you going to stay faithful to the person, even if they're not? Even if they don't want to fight for the relationship, even if they're choosing against you like the Israelites were? Which is why the idolatry of the Israelites in the book of Judges is like religious infidelity. If you think of a person cheating on their spouse, it's kind of like that, what the Israelites are doing. And if you think of a couple where one person cheats on their spouse and they don't end the relationship, the other person has it in them somehow to forgive them. And they're faithful even when the other person isn't. When the infidelitous person, the person who is unfaithful. Yeah. Thank you. That's a great commitment to the relationship. Yeah, I'm not sure about his situation, but in the story of Israel, they're in that cycle. They're good, everything's healthy, it's nice, they're worshiping God, they turn from him. They seek idolatry, They fall into oppression. Then they cry out. And God is faithful each time. And he's not, to be fair, to be clear, he's not saying that their sin doesn't matter. Like, you'll read multiple times in the story of Othniel, it said he gave them over to oppression. He's saying, if this is what you want, you're going to feel what that's like. But then he doesn't leave them there. He doesn't leave them there forever. So God is showing us in Judges that even in the face of repeated apostasy and unfaithfulness, his people consistently turning from him, he will not entirely or permanently leave them. And the Old Testament is full of stories like this. Moses strikes the rock, and then he can't enter the promised land. There is a punishment for sin, but God still leads his people there. Hosea, if you're familiar with him, it's a shorter book in the Old Testament, but God tells him that he needs to go marry a prostitute, which is kind of a crazy thing, right? And he does. And their relationship becomes an image of faithfulness in the midst of unfaithfulness. And it's like what God is doing in Judges. His wife, his bride, the church, his people are unfaithful, and he continues to be faithful, and he restores them. And the greatest and certainly most personal story for us, sometimes the Old Testament stories can seem long ago and far away, but the one for us is the story of God's faithfulness in caring for us in Jesus Christ. Because when we are sinning, choosing against him, worshiping other gods, he sent his Son to atone for us. Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3 says, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven." So the Judges were God's provision at that time for his people. And they were used by God. His Spirit was upon them to deliver the Israelites from the oppression that their sin, their idolatry, brought them into. But Jesus is the once and for all, the final sacrifice, the victory over sin and death, the radiance of God's glory, and the exact representation of his being. What I learned from Judges, what I hope we can learn together, is that God's being is faithful, that he cares, that he will not leave us. And Jesus is the exact representation of his being, the radiance of his glory. And that's what he's done for us in his Son. He is the one who ultimately saves us from our sin, our idolatry, and our oppression and slavery. The Lord, who has made all these things happen, who has created the world and has not left his people in its history even when they turn against him, if that is the God that you worship, then please join me in the Apostles' Creed, which you can find in the bottom side of your folder.